Hello and welcome to Rising Clyde, the Scottish Climate Justice Show. I'm Ian Bruce, and in this programme we're going back to COP28, the UN climate talks in Dubai, to ask what really did happen, and does it matter anyway?
Hearing no objection, it is so decided.
It's now around a month since the UAE's Sultan Al Jaber brought down the gavel on the 28th Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP28. The world's media and most people have already forgotten about it. But some people did hail its most obvious outcome, the recognition after 30 years that the climate crisis is in fact a fossil fuel crisis, as historic, as Scotland's First Minister Humza Yousaf put it just after the conference ended.
When the heat gets high, when the heat gets high, and the people rise, and the people rise.
Others point to what the Samoan chief negotiator Anne Rasmussen, also the chair of the Small Island States Group, calls a litany of loopholes, as evidence that the whole COP process has been taken over by the fossil fuel industry and is definitively not fit for purpose. So what do the results of COP28 mean, and what, if anything, should we do with them?
The end of fossil fuels.
In order to discuss some of this and try and pick it apart, I'm very happy to have with us today Scott Kirby in Edinburgh. Scott is part of the UK Youth Climate Coalition. He was in Dubai on their behalf as part of their COP28 team. And also we have Dorothy Guerrero in London. Dorothy is head of policy at Global Justice Now, and a well-known figure to many of those in the climate justice movement here in Scotland, as well as in England and elsewhere in the UK. So thank you very much to both of you for joining us. Dorothy, you said in, I think it was the last blog post you did at the end of the COP, that it had been worth being there. Why?
Well, yes, it is. Before the COP28, of course, there's a lot of debate whether movements, climate justice campaigners should instead boycott Dubai because of the fact that COP president is the CEO of the national oil company of Dubai, and it's a big. It's not just a small oil company; it's one of the biggest oil company. But I think the fact that decisions were made, it is important that civil society organizations were there, supporting the developing countries on their stance, pressuring the rich countries on their positions and what they're pushing in this big north-south divide. It was important that groups were there protesting every day and also educating each other on what is happening right there and there. So it is, I would say, the COP is still the political center of the political arena on climate. So it is important that people continue attending, continue making noise, and at the same time continuing their support to the developing country negotiators.
Thank you. Scott, talking about the UAE presidency and Sultan Al Jaber being also the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, one of the things you were focusing on, I think, was the potential conflict of interest. Tell us how all that played out for you and first of all, your general impression of the outcome.
Well, I think to put it quite simply, when oil companies are celebrating the outcome of COP, something's not gone quite too well. But this year, the campaign that my organization were running was on the general conflicts of interest and corporate capture that we find COP to be really affected by. And we knew last year there were hundreds of oil executives that attended COP27 in Egypt at Sharm el-Sheikh, and based on the fact that the presidency and the president himself was, as we mentioned, the CEO of ADNOC, we were expecting that number to increase, and it did. There were 2,456 oil execs that we knew about or people involved in that lobby at COP. And it raises serious questions, I guess, around the legitimacy of the process and as to how much progress we are making towards, the convention and really just solving climate change, I guess, if you put it simply. So we wanted to use this COP as an opportunity to re-raise this concern. Conflict of interest has been a concern for many, many years now in the COP space and in the UNFCCC. And with the president being the ultimate example of what conflict of interest represents at COP, we wanted to make sure that it was highlighted as big an issue as it ever has been. And from what we can tell, and from, as I said, that number 2,456 oil execs being in the space, we know it was the right time to highlight that, because the issue has been as big as it ever has been. As I said right at the beginning there, oil companies celebrating the final result of COP, that it hasn't exactly gone in the favor of civil society and generally people and planet. So there are serious questions to be raised about.
You say, Scott, as big as it ever has been. I noticed that Azerbaijan has just announced the next president of COP29, also a previous, former oil executive, I believe this time, not 30 years standing, I believe, now in the government. Given the kind of heavy presence of oil executives and oil lobbyists and so on and so forth, can we still say, do you think, Dottie, that let's try and balance it out. The fact that for the first time ever, they finally recognized what to most people was blindingly obvious for decades, that fossil fuels are actually at the core of the problem and need to go. How does that, that is a sort of a step forward of sorts, right? Yeah. But what are the loopholes and how do they work and how grave are they? I suppose that's what I think we want to try and explain to people, because I think that people know that there are loopholes, but what are they and how bad are they?
Mm-hmm. Well, before I mention the loopholes, it is important also to acknowledge that precisely maybe because the COP president is the chief executive of ADNOC, but also a minister. He is also a minister in his country. That is a different kind of character, in a sense that we are dealing here with a national oil company, which is different from a private transnational oil company. But setting that aside, I think the fact that he was the COP president made the issue of fossil fuel right and center in the discussion. But then also at the same time, we also have to see what actually happened before that decision. Because on the draft of December 8th, the fossil fuel phase out was in that draft. And then it was removed on the December 11 draft. And then there was a draft that was floated around, which is very, very close to the final decision. So the loopholes there is that, of course, we did not get the actual wording of fossil fuel phase out. But it's not just because it was the COP president's hand in it. I would rather point to the fact that although countries like the UK, the EU, and the US wanted or even dangle the word fossil fuel phase out in all the strings of negotiation, the developing countries are complaining that you can't just put fossil fuel phase out when you're not putting the means of implementation. And the means of implementation is, will it be funded? Will it be recognized that different countries have different capacities and responsibilities? Because if you want to realize a just transition and the fossil fuel phase out, that has to be funded. And that is the big failure of this negotiation. The money, or the exact amount, the commensurate amount of money, was not there. So Although the northern countries wanted to present themselves as the heroes, actually they bullied the southern countries by just putting that without acknowledging and agreeing on the means of implementation, which is funding, which is technology transfer. And they've been doing that for the last 30 years as well. This is not the first
So
time.
it's not, I mean, in a sense, CEOs of oil companies as presidents are an easy target, and they're not the kind of the serious culprits lie elsewhere. Is that you're suggesting, right?
Well,
How do you see that,
presidents have
Scott?
a way of course, because they are the ones that can call any party on the bilateral discussions. But at the end of the day, it's still the respective negotiators that are negotiating. And here you have 134 G77 in China member countries, and then you have the rich countries that and this is operate by consensus. So if they veto or if they don't agree on anything, then there will be no consensus. So at the end of the day, it's still a negotiation, and there is, I think, more than ever that big conflict, the North-South conflict that emerged.
Yeah. And in fact, in the last program we had before COP, Nathan Thankey of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative was pointing out that, I asked him about the emissions gap and the huge difference between what countries say they're going to do and what they're actually doing. And he said, yes, that's true, but better than the emissions gap is to look at the production gap. In other words, the kind of actual investments and plans to produce fossil fuels that exist. And, again, those countries that, as you just said, Dottie, US, UK, EU, say they're in favor of phasing out, or said they were in favor of phasing out, are also the ones that are investing most in new oil and gas production. So, Scott, I mean, how does this play out in Scotland? Because on a small scale, we have a little bit of the same issue here. I mean, we have a Scottish government that's making quite progressive noises about some of these things, and yet refuses to come out clearly against Rosebank. Hasn't really taken a clear position on well, it has on new licenses in the North Sea, but not on the existing licenses in the North Sea. Yeah? So, I mean, how does this play out for us?
I mean, there's a real dichotomy, I suppose, in terms of what Scottish government is saying internationally in the COP space and what they're saying domestically. So, for example, Humza Yousaf spent nearly 4 or 5 days at COP28 and spoke entirely about loss and damage, which for many in the civil society space, Scotland were one of the first movers on loss and damage last year, and Scotland would claim that they were one of the reasons why there's nearly £600 million now in a loss and damage fund. That when you have conversations with people about where we were this time last year, the fund didn't even exist. So they're trying to be very progressive in the international climate space. However, you're right. When you look at what's happening domestically, we're still having to deal with continued investment in the oil and gas sector in the North Sea, which partially some of that is actually down to how this is the devolved nature of this and what UK government are doing themselves. But it doesn't quite marry up. You can't, on one hand, be talking about really progressive climate justice, forward-thinking investments such as putting money into a loss and damage fund, and then not be doing anything about what is causing climate change in the way of fossil fuel extraction in Scotland. So there is something to be said about that differentiation, and I think a lot of it will play out going into the next general election as to where Scotland really lands on that.
Tell us a bit more about that, because I understand you had quite a bit of contact with Humza Yousaf in Dubai. You say he was mainly talking about and working on questions of loss and damage. Tell us a bit more about what he was saying to you about that.
Yeah, I mean, so Humza, there was several announcements that he was involved in. Scotland, because they're a non-party actor but still a state, have been trying to find a way in the space. So have joined with C40, which is the Cities 40 group, and have, I think, announced £1 million to them in terms of urban loss and damage. Not quite sure entirely what that means yet, but I'm sure C40 will figure that out going forward, and they have just put a report out. And I think in total, Scotland announced something like £2 million pounds of new loss and damage funding, which, again, if we go back to last year, they were one of the first countries that even dedicated any money to loss and damage. So the majority of what they were doing at COP28 was talking around that issue, and we tried to speak to Hamza about thinking around being a first mover in another space, which is the conflict of interest space. And no countries or parties are really open about the fact that there is so much fossil fuel interest in COP. And like one way of thinking about it is you wouldn't have the tobacco lobby in the WHO, and the WHO bans that lobby because it quite obviously comes at odds to the whole mandate of health. Similarly, you could make that argument about fossil fuels and climate change, and no party wants to be upfront about that because there's so much corporate capture of the fossil fuel industry at COP. So we were trying to have conversations with Hamza because they're not a party and because they've shown to be a progressive first mover on some issues, to be like, how about Scotland come forward and acknowledge that conflicts of interest is obviously an issue within the COP space.
Did he sound receptive to the idea?
I think so, yes, if I'm honest. But I think part of that is when you're a state and not a party, there is a limitation as to what you can do and be involved in. And taking a forward-thinking stance on loss and damage and spiraling all that money that went into the fund at COP28, and perhaps even taking a forward-thinking stance on something like conflicts of interest is something that Scotland as a non-party actor can think about doing, because they don't necessarily have to think about the politics of actually being a party negotiation team. So, who knows really? We're going to continue that conversation going forward. But
we had a very similar conversation at the last program with Nathan about the possibility of Scotland endorsing the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty initiative. So that could, maybe there's a couple of angles we could take up and push with the Scottish government a bit further.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Dorothy, how did you see the progress made on the loss and damage issue, if it was progress?
That was a big opening, big positive opening in the negotiation when they approved that on the first day. Normally, such approval happened on the last day when everyone's hanging on what will happen. However, when the pledges started coming in, and these are just pledges, mind you, at the moment there's around $700 million in pledges. But if we will scrutinize the kind of pledges, so the UAE gave a good start and pledged 100 million. It may sound big, but when it comes to what is actually needed, the developing countries need between 100 to 250 billion dollars per year by 2030. So Germany followed with 100. The laughable pledge of the US of 17.5 million. Hello, that's like what, 5 windmills or 6 windmills? And considering the historic and huge emission, and it's not even approved because it has to go through Congress. So it's just really a pledge. So the 700 million, although it is not ideal, it is a start, and hopefully this year more and more countries will pledge and higher and commensurate to their responsibility, because this is really an obligation. But loss and damage is just one of the pillars of finance. You also have the adaptation and mitigation finance. And the $100 billion that was promised in Copenhagen is not yet visible. They said it's
really
almost
still
there, but
still not there.
Still not there. So they said almost there, but could still, wait until 2025. So this is really how they roll. Like they, empty promises, landmarks that are shifted, promises and decision already decided, and then it will be watered down in the next negotiation. But I think this year, of course, last year, I'm still on 2023. Of course, 2023 is about loss and damage. There was a decision, there was a transitional committee, and now approval. We are now in the operationalization. this year, 2024, the highlight will be finance. Because whatever it is, whether it's stopping fossil fuel or funding mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, it would need finance. So the big question that we have to pose and also push our government in the UK government, the Scottish government, is where is the money? There is money, but on wrong priorities. They've been using a lot of money on war, but not on climate, not on on the just transition, and on fast tracking renewables. So we really need to increase renewables in the energy mix because that's the only way that emission will drop.
You mentioned the just transition there, which is another thing I wanted to ask about, because that's also a new component, right, in the COP process.
Yeah,
An area.
it started this year,
Can,
and
can,
there
can
was
you can you explain can you explain exactly how that came about and what's happening there?
well, actually, the civil society can claim that this is something that we really push from the streets to the table, and now they are discussing it. There were, I think, four meetings and some committee discussions, and I've attended those meetings. And one of the debates, because they're still putting all the elements together, if there will be a follow up in the Bonn meeting and also in the Baku meeting. So just transition is precisely how all these fall into place. Because we've always say we can't have climate justice without just transition. So no, now that they started to discuss this, it has to be in a way where one there would be a sort of a time frame. Because at the moment they say it might be 4 years, might be 5 years. But then who knows? It could be like loss and damage. It goes to 3 decades. Hopefully, it will be shorter. And two, we really push that the principles of equity, the principles of international cooperation, and the recognition of the different needs and conditions and capacity of different regions and countries must be recognized. Because when we talk of just transition, it's not just about issue of retraining workers, especially if it's about energy transition. Again, it's a question of who should do it first, with what money, with what funding, with what technology. And that is where the difference and conflicts will come in. Because you have the interstate conflicts, and at the same time, the question of who will fund it.
I mean, does it also take account of, I mean, an issue that I've heard come up quite a bit in, or let's say I've heard come up more in climate justice circles recently, is the recognition that, transitioning to renewables, which is something happening mostly in the north, in the global north, requires digging a lot of stuff out of the ground in the global south. And how exactly you balance those two things together and do it on a scale and in a way that's kind of just for the people in the global south who are having their lands mined and so on and so forth, is not an easy problem, but I don't know if that's even on the horizon in terms of the COP discussions of a just transition, is it?
Well, there was a mention already of what to do with critical minerals. There were also already a discussion as well on whether um, who should do it first, because that is the basic question, because there are differences on the capacity and conditions. Of course, there's no question that it should be those countries that are historic emitters and huge emitters that should do it first, because that's only fair. But then also there's a difference on the capacity of, say, the UK and Mali. We should not force developing countries that are still addressing the question of energy poverty to all of a sudden talk about transition when they don't own the technology. These are again um, um, owned and controlled by transnational corporation. And of course, yes, you can't talk about transition without talking about critical minerals. And also, there will still be a need to to continue digging on steel, on copper, on lithium, because these are the elements of the components of renewable energy.
So you think those issues are recognized in the process?
Well, at the moment, it's not yet in the text, but they were discussed in the discussion on the elements, because it's like they're putting together what will be the component of this just transition, and then afterwards they will come up with what they will negotiate on. But I think at the moment, we focus on putting the principles of equity on the common but differentiated capacity, and responsibility, CBDR, RC, and then also that it should be there should be international cooperation in it, because at first the developed countries insisted that transition should be done on the national level. It's wrong, because you can't do transition on your own, because the issue is there should be a global move to transition from high fossil fuel use and high fossil fuel dependent economy towards a lower towards less of that dependency, and it can't be done on a national level, especially if poorer countries don't have the technology and they don't have funding. So the question of funding, technology, and who should do it first are critical on that aspect.
Scott, what do you feel in the end? What do you want to bring back from Dubai and kind of use now, at home?
It's a difficult question. I guess just the general disappointment that we feel from the process and from how things went this year. Going back to what you said earlier, what the loopholes that were kind of put into the process. I mean, the language on the draft text calls upon countries to do things like triple renewable energy and accelerate efforts towards a phase down. But as I saw a great tweet by Leo Hickman of Carbon Brief, who basically said what that means in kind of layman's terms is asking your daughter, please, could you voluntarily clean your room, as opposed to demanding that they do it right now. So it's a good way of contextualizing, like, countries kind of don't really have to follow or abide by the text in the current form that it's in, legally speaking, in terms of the way the text is presented. So a lot of people like myself and civil society came away from COP feeling very disheartened. It's quite difficult to remember a time when you didn't come away from the process feeling that way, but it's the converse of that is you come away feeling galvanized that there is a lot more to do. And I'm sure organizations across civil society feel that way when they go back to their home countries, of trying to galvanize action domestically and continue in that conversation and that engagement with their governments so that, next time we get to COP, we have a bit more progress made. And it's a multilateral process, COP. Like, it's going to be slow. There is a question of what would exist if we didn't have COP, which is, there's a bit more of an existential question about, do you boycott it? Do you not? Is it working fast enough? What would be the alternative of it be? But we have to accept that at the moment, as Dorothy said, this is the center of kind of the efforts towards trying to solve climate change multilaterally. So the best that we can do is come away from the process, soak up all that disappointment, and try and do what we can domestically, so that next time we get to COP this year in Azerbaijan, we've got a better foot to stand on and more that we can do to see some more progress, basically.
I mean, I suppose it depends a little bit on what your level of expectations were.
Yeah, true.
If you go in with pretty low expectations, then maybe the level of disappointment is, a little bit less. How do you deal with that, Dottie? I mean, what do you say to people when they say exactly what Scott's just said?
I often say that don't take the COP decision or the annual COP decision individually, because you have to look at the history, and at the same time, what are the previous decisions wherein there's a connection with the current decisions, like on the global stock take. This is the first COP as well where there was a global stock take. On the positive side, there was a recognition that the efforts were not enough, and that the targets and also the space, the atmospheric space, the carbon budget is getting smaller, and the ergo there's a smaller room now to ensure that what the COP president called the North Star of 1.5 degrees centigrade limit to the warming uh, there is that acknowledgement. But then, of course, the frustrating part is when it comes to the decisions, it doesn't match that acknowledgement that so much more needs to be done. I think I will also look at the different part of the decisions, which is, for example, on adaptation and mitigation. There were some that we can build on. At least on the positive side, the carbon market element that they wanted to really bulldoze on the text did not happen. So at least that's one positive element. Excuse me. There's also the element that on the technologies and also the questions on or the acknowledgement that there must be much more finance needed than what is on the table. So at least that's a good acknowledgement. So I will say that let's look at the negotiation as part of a whole. Of course, it is less than what we expect, but theoretically, now that they're talking or they mention fossil fuels for the first time in the text, that at least is far better than 2 years ago when in Glasgow that was not even mentioned, because that could also mean the investment on fossil fuels could be more risky, because if there is that pathway to or the plan to move away from fossil fuels when it comes to investment, we can push for more investments on renewables instead of fossil fuels. We can push to end subsidy, although in the text it's this weasel word of inefficient subsidy. Who can judge what is efficient and inefficient subsidy? So we can just say outrightly, stop the subsidy. It was already mentioned by the International Energy Authority. There was already mentioned in many, even the IMF was talking about that. So let's do it now, remove the subsidy. And I think on the national level, on the question of finance, we really need to push that polluters must pay. Uh, we have seen all the quarterly reports of fossil fuel corporations, all these eye-watering profits they've been making every quarter. So there is that money. Tax them. And not just one windfall tax, but more permanent tax. So in terms of policy and what we can build from this result, there are some that we can follow with campaigns and with policy changes here in the UK and Scotland. And of course, fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty is something alive. From the COP, now 12 countries are signed onto it. And I have a pretty strong feeling that Scotland will also sign onto it. So that could be at least something good to start with. And then let's see what will happen.
Thank you very much. Well, at least the inadequacies of COP, hopefully at least act as a spur for us to do a lot more on our part, and that includes some of the things you've been talking about, including pressing the Scottish Government to sign that treaty. Thank you very much indeed to both of you. We're kind of out of time, but that's really interesting. That's all we have time for this episode of Rising Clyde. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Dorothy Guerrero of Global Justice Now and Scott Kirby of the UK Youth Climate Coalition. Until next time, goodbye.
Yeah, and thank you, Ian, for all this work you're doing.